The crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors, so polished they mirrored the ceiling 3 stories above. Every surface in the Grand Millennium Hotel ballroom whispered wealth. Italian leather chairs arranged in perfect rows, fresh orchids imported from Ecuador perched on tables worth more than most cars, waiters in tailored uniforms gliding between guests who wore watches that cost what teachers earned in years. The air itself felt expensive, thick with perfume that came in bottles shaped like art and cologne that required appointments to purchase. A charity gala for the Metropolitan Arts Foundation, where the city's elite gathered to write checks that would ease their tax burdens while photographers captured their generosity from morning papers. Near the service entrance, partially hidden behind a velvet curtain designed to shield guests from seeing how their food arrived, an old man stood perfectly still. His suit had once been black, but decades had faded it to charcoal gray, the fabric shiny at the elbows where he'd rested his arms on countless surfaces, waiting. The collar of his white shirt had yellowed despite washing, and his tie, narrow, outdated by 20 years, hung slightly crooked. His shoes, though freshly polished, couldn't hide the cracks in the leather or the way the soles had worn thin on the outside edges from years of walking the same paths. He held his weathered hands clasped before him, knuckles swollen from arthritis that made cold mornings and exercise impatience. Deep lines creased his face, mapping 7 decades of early mornings and late nights, of carrying weight both literal and otherwise. His eyes, though, pale blue and startlingly clear, tracked the room with intensity that belied his stillness. Before we proceed, let me ask something of you watching this unfold. Comment below and tell me where you're witnessing this moment from. Whether you're in Tokyo or Tennessee, Lagos or London, I want to know where you are when you hear what happens next. Because this story belongs to everyone who's ever been invisible, and I'm curious how far it travels. The old man had arrived 3 hours early, taking 2 buses and walking the final mile because parking cost $40. He'd waited in the service corridor, ignored by staff rushing past with trays of champagne and plates of food arranged like architecture. No one questioned his presence. His faded suit created a strange camouflage, making him seem like he belonged to the building itself, a fixture too mundane to notice. He watched guests arrive through the main entrance, emerging from town cars and limousines, women in gowns that cost what he'd paid for his entire house 40 years ago, men in custom suits discussing mergers over cocktails. The pianist hired for the evening, a young prodigy fresh from Juilliard, according to the program, performed near the bar, his fingers dancing across keys in technically perfect renditions of Chopin and Debussy that provided pleasant background noise for conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes. The old man waited for the break between sets, that moment when the hired talent stepped away for water and the crowd's attention diffused into smaller conversations. He moved then, emerging from his corner with careful steps, crossing the ballroom floor toward the grand piano positioned on a raised platform. The instrument gleamed under spotlights, a Steinway concert grand worth more than most people's homes, its black lacquer finish reflecting the chandelier light like still water. He'd barely reached the piano's bench when a voice cut across the ambient noise, sharp enough to turn heads. "Excuse me. Excuse me. The man approaching wore authority like cologne. Too much, applied too liberally. Richard Blackwell III, founder and CEO of Blackwell Capital Management, moved through the world expecting it to rearrange itself around his preferences. At 52, he'd maintained the athletic build of his Yale rowing days through personal trainers and careful diet, his silver hair styled in a way that cost $200 to look effortlessly casual. His tuxedo had been made in Milan, fitted 4 times to achieve perfection. A Patek Philippe watch circled his wrist, its complications tracking time zones he flew to in private jets. He'd made his first billion in hedge funds, his second in real estate, his third in technology companies he didn't pretend to understand beyond their profit margins. Forbes had featured him twice. His name appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. People at parties leaned forward when he spoke, hoping his financial acumen might somehow transfer through proximity. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Blackwell's voice carried across the ballroom, drawing eyes and silencing nearby conversations. "That piano is for the evening's hired entertainment. It's not a a public instrument for anyone to wander up and touch. The old man turned slowly, meeting Blackwell's gaze with unsettling calm. "I was hoping," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, "that I might play one song. Just one. I won't disturb." "You won't disturb." Blackwell's laugh came sharp and quick, designed to cut. "You've already disturbed. Look around you. This is a private event. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation Gala. Tickets are $10,000 per seat. Did you pay $10,000? Silence spread like spilled wine. Conversations dying as people turned to watch. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them tighter. "I didn't come through the main entrance. I thought, I only want to play one song. I used to." "You used to what?" "Play piano." Blackwell stepped closer, his cologne overwhelming, his presence designed to intimidate through sheer proximity. "Let me guess. You played in some bar somewhere, decades ago, and now you've wandered in here thinking you belong at an instrument worth more than everything you own combined." Heat crept up the old man's neck, coloring his weathered face. Around them, the crowd had formed a loose circle, wealthy spectators drawn to conflict like crows to carrion. Some looked uncomfortable, but none moved to intervene. The social calculus was clear. Blackwell's name appeared on too many donor lists, controlled too many boards, wielded too much influence. Defending a confused old man in an outdated suit wasn't worth the political cost. "I just want to play one song," the old man repeated, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Please, just one." Blackwell's smile spread slow and cruel. He glanced at the crowd, performing now, feeding off their attention. "Tell you what, old-timer, since this is a charity event, let's make this charitable. You want to play so badly. Fine. Prove you can. Play something, anything. And if it's genuinely good, if you can demonstrate actual skill at this instrument, I'll personally write a check for $50,000 to the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. Right here, right now." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people pulled out phones, sensing something worth recording. The hired pianist, returned from his break and watching from the bar, looked uncertain whether to intervene. But Blackwell continued, his voice rising, "When you can't, when you sit down at that bench and prove you're just a confused old man who wandered in off the street, you leave immediately. Security will escort you out. And everyone here will have witnessed that this event, this foundation, this community has standards. That we don't let just anyone touch instruments worth more than they'll own in a lifetime. Do we have a deal?" The old man stood silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. His right hand moved unconsciously, fingers flexing in patterns, muscle memory asserting itself unbidden. In his mind, different music played, not Chopin or Debussy, nothing the crowd would expect. Something older, something that carried weight beyond notes on a page. "Yes," he said finally, "we have a deal." The old man lowered himself onto the piano bench with careful deliberation, his movements slow not from confusion but from intention. His weathered hands hovered above the keys for 3 seconds that stretched like hours, fingers trembling slightly in the spotlight's glare. The ballroom had gone quiet enough to hear the ventilation system's whisper, the distant clink of a glass being set down too hard on marble. 200 faces watched, most expecting embarrassment, a few hoping for it, entertainment to enliven an evening of obligation disguised as charity. When his fingers finally touched ivory, the first note emerged so softly it barely reached beyond the piano itself. A single key, C above middle, held with pressure that suggested reverence rather than uncertainty. Then another note joined it, and another, building a melody that took 5 full seconds before anyone recognized it. Not Chopin, not Debussy, not anything the evening's hired prodigy had performed during his technically perfect but emotionally hollow sets. Clair de Lune. Debussy after all, but not the version anyone expected. The old man played it transformed, slower than any recording, each note given space to breathe and decay before the next arrived. His interpretation stripped away showmanship, dissolved technique into something raw. The melody emerged like moonlight through clouds, patient and inevitable. His arthritic fingers moved with surprising precision, finding keys without looking, muscle memory overriding decades of disuse. Near the bar, a woman in a crimson gown stopped mid-sentence, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. The hired pianist's expression shifted from amusement to something else, recognition tinged with confusion. A tech billionaire who'd been checking his phone lowered it slowly, drawn by something in the sound he couldn't immediately identify but felt in his chest. Blackwell stood 10 feet from the piano, his smile still fixed but beginning to strain at the edges. This wasn't what he'd anticipated. The old man should have fumbled, struck wrong keys, proven the point Blackwell wanted proven. Instead, the music filling the ballroom possessed a quality that made people's conversations feel suddenly trivial, their expensive clothes and jewelry hollow decorations. The piece moved through its familiar progression, but the old man's touch revealed depths the hired pianist's perfect technique had glossed over. Grief in the minor passages, hope in the resolution, something indefinably human in the spaces between notes. Someone coughed. A woman shifted in designer heels that had stopped hurting because she'd forgotten them entirely. The old man's eyes remained closed, his lined face peaceful, transported to somewhere beyond the ballroom's crystal and marble. His foot worked the pedal with practiced subtlety, sustaining bass notes while treble melodies danced above them. Occasionally his shoulders moved with the music's swell, conducting himself through passages that required his whole body's engagement. When the piece ended, the final chord held until its resonance dissolved into silence. Nobody moved. The old man's hands remained on the keys for a moment before settling into his lap. He opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from great distance. The applause started from the back, a single person clapping, then another, then 5, then 20. Within seconds the entire ballroom had erupted, wealthy guests rising to their feet despite themselves, formal training overriding social calculation. They'd witnessed something authentic, rare in rooms where everything was performed and calculated. The hired pianist was clapping hardest, his young face showing genuine admiration unmixed with jealousy. Blackwell's face had frozen into a mask of controlled fury, but he was clapping too, because not clapping would be social suicide. He'd created this situation, made his challenge public, and now he stood trapped by his own words. From the crowd, a man stepped forward. Dr. James Morrison, former director of the New England Conservatory, his white beard immaculate, his tuxedo worn with the ease of someone who'd attended thousands of such events. At 78, he'd heard enough piano performances to fill lifetimes, had taught prodigies who now headlined Carnegie Hall, had judged competitions in Vienna and Tokyo. He approached the piano with the slow dignity of age and authority combined. "Extraordinary," Morrison said, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Whoever taught you played under Cortot? I'd stake my reputation on it." The pedaling, the rubato, that particular way of voicing the inner melodies, those are hallmarks of the French school, but filtered through someone who studied with a master himself. There are perhaps 3 pianists alive who played Debussy that way, and all of them trained in Paris between 1945 and 1960. The old man remained seated, his weathered hands folded again in his lap. "My instructor studied in Paris," he said quietly. 1946 through 1951. Conservatoire de Paris. Morrison's eyes widened. "Good Lord. With whom?" She never said Cortet's name directly, but she had photographs. Old ones. A young woman standing beside an elderly man at a piano. She said he taught her everything that mattered. Around them, the crowd's murmur had shifted from appreciation to curiosity. These weren't casual music listeners. Many had donated enough to earn their names on conservatory buildings, had children who'd studied piano from age 4, could distinguish competent from excellent through expensive education. They recognized that something beyond simple skill had just been demonstrated. Blackwell had recovered his composure, rearranging his face into something approximating graciousness. "Well," he said, his voice too loud, "a deal is a deal." That was certainly adequate. Better than adequate. Clearly you've had training. My checkbook is in my jacket. Wait. The woman in the crimson gown stepped forward now, her champagne abandoned on a nearby table. Patricia Thornton, conductor of the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra, her reputation built on absolute musical integrity and willingness to speak truth regardless of consequence. I need to understand something. You play like that, with that depth of interpretation, that level of control despite obvious arthritis in your hands, and you're here in a $70 suit asking permission to touch a piano. What happened to you? The old man looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his pale eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried new weight, history pressing against present. I taught piano, he said, for 43 years. Elementary school, public school on the south side. Same building, same classroom, same instruments, upright pianos donated by churches, half the keys sticking, quarter of them out of tune. I taught because someone had taught me, and she'd said music belonged to everyone, not just people who could afford Steinways and private lessons. I taught kids whose parents worked 3 jobs, who came to school hungry, who used practice time as escape from apartments where heat got shut off in January. Some learned, most didn't, but I taught them all, because my instructor had taught me despite. He stopped, something painful crossing his face. Despite circumstances. Thornton moved closer, her gown whispering against marble. Your instructor, the one who studied in Paris. What was her name? The old man's hands trembled again, harder now, not from age but from emotion rising like floodwater behind a weakening dam. Catherine Hayes. She died in 1982. Pancreatic cancer. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 70 years old and had nothing. Lived in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner. Gave lessons for whatever people could pay, sometimes for nothing. She taught me for free when I was 15 because my father had just died and my mother was working nights at a hospital to keep us fed. She taught me for 6 years, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, until I left for college on a scholarship she helped me get. Everything I know, everything I can do at a piano, came from her. She said music was dignity made audible, that in a world designed to crush certain people, beauty was resistance. The ballroom had gone still again, but different than before. This silence carried weight, recognition of something beyond performance. Before anyone else could respond, Patricia Thornton had pulled her phone from somewhere in her gown's elegant folds, was typing rapidly, muttering to herself. Catherine Hayes, Conservatoire de Paris, 1946. She stayed at her screen, scrolled, stopped. Her face went pale. Oh my God. Thornton's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Catherine Hayes, French citizen, entered the Conservatoire de Paris in September 1946 at age 34, which was almost unheard of. They rarely accepted students over 20. She graduated with highest honors in 1951, specializing in French repertoire. She performed across Europe through the 50s, was being called the most important interpreter of Debussy since Giselle Brelet. Then she vanished from the international scene in 1961. The last official record I'm finding is a single concert at Wigmore Hall in London, reviewed in the Times. The critic wrote. She paused, reading. Miss Hayes plays with such emotional transparency that one feels indecent listening, as though witnessing something too personal for public consumption. After that, nothing. No more concert dates, no recordings, no mention in any major musical publication. She just disappeared. The old man's eyes remained fixed on some point beyond the ballroom walls, beyond the present moment entirely. She didn't disappear. She came to America, to someone, a man she'd met during the war, who'd promised her marriage and a good life. She followed him here in 1962, gave up her career, her reputation, everything she'd built. When she arrived, she discovered he'd married someone else 3 months earlier. Local woman, family money, political connections. He told her the promises had been wartime fantasy, that she'd misunderstood, that she should return to France. But she had no money for passage, had burned bridges leaving Europe, had been too proud to tell anyone why she was really going. So she stayed. Found work teaching piano to children in whatever communities would hire her. Never married. Never performed publicly again. Lived alone and taught for 30 years until the cancer killed her. Patricia Thornton's hand had risen to her mouth. Dear God, one of the greatest pianists of her generation, and she spent 3 decades teaching scales to elementary students because some man. She stopped, rage choking the words. She didn't see it as waste, the old man said softly. She told me once that music had been her salvation during the war. She'd hidden from German soldiers in a church in Lyon, stayed silent for 16 hours while they searched the building, and kept herself sane by playing Bach's Goldberg variations in her mind, note for note, all 30 variations and both arias. She said if music could do that, carry someone through terror into mourning, then teaching it to even one child who needed it justified any sacrifice. She said she'd lived through what happened when humans forgot beauty existed. Teaching was remembering. Dr. Morrison had moved closer, his aged face working through emotions. I knew of Catherine Hayes. Read her reviews when I was a young man studying in Boston. I'd wondered what happened to her, why she'd stopped performing. We all assumed she'd died or perhaps returned to France. To think she was in this very city, teaching in public schools. He shook his head. The loss to the musical world is incalculable. The gain to the students who had her was immeasurable, the old man counted, some steel entering his voice despite its quietness. She taught hundreds of children. Most forgot what she taught them as soon as they could. Some remembered the basics, played in church or for their own pleasure. A few became music teachers themselves, passed forward what she'd given them. And one, his voice caught. One student she took under her wing despite having no reason to, no compensation, no recognition. She taught him because his father had died and left his mother with 3 children in debt, because the boy loved music the way drowning people love air, because she said she saw in him the same desperate hunger she'd felt during the war. She taught him on a battered upright in her apartment that smelled like dry cleaning fluid, taught him Chopin and Debussy and Ravel, taught him that beauty was defiance and art was dignity. She taught him until he was good enough for university, then helped him get a scholarship. When he graduated and returned to thank her, she told him one thing: teach. Pass it forward. Make sure music reaches the people who need it most, not just those who can afford it. The old man reached into his worn jacket with shaking hands, withdrew a folded envelope yellowed with age. The paper felt fragile between his arthritic fingers as he opened it, revealing a single photograph and a card. He held them up for the gathering crowd to see. The photograph showed a young woman in her 30s, beautiful in the way strength makes people beautiful, standing beside an elderly man at a piano. The man's hair was white, his face deeply lined, his hands resting on keys with casual authority. On the back, in faded ink, with my instructor, Paris 1950, ch. The card was simpler, handwritten in elegant script that had blurred slightly with decades of handling. To my last and best student, music is not entertainment. It is not career or commodity. It is the soul's defense against a world that wants to number and diminish us. Play as if beauty is the only truth. Teach as if children are the only future. Remember me not in concert halls, but in classrooms where the forgotten learn they matter. Catherine Hayes, 1982 inch. She wrote that 6 weeks before she died, the old man said. Left it with her landlord to give me after. I've carried it for 43 years. Every day I taught, every child who sat at those broken pianos in that underfunded school, I carried her words. I taught music like it was a life raft because she taught me it was. Thornton had tears running down her face, her mascara smearing despite being professionally applied. And now, why are you here tonight, at a gala for an arts foundation, asking to play one song? The old man's voice dropped so low people leaned forward to hear. The school where I taught for 43 years is being closed. Budget cuts. The city says elementary music education is not essential, that instruments and teachers cost too much, that children can access music through computers and phones. The building becomes a charter school next fall, focused on math and test scores. The pianos, even the broken ones, are being removed, sold for scrap weight. 107 students currently taking music lessons will have nowhere to go. Most can't afford private instruction. Their parents work hourly jobs, live paycheck to paycheck. When the school closes, music leaves their lives permanently. He paused, looking around the ballroom at faces that had softened from curiosity to something approaching shame. I came here because I read that the Metropolitan Arts Foundation's mission is ensuring musical education access for all children regardless of economic circumstance. I thought if I could just speak to someone, explain what's happening, maybe there would be help. But security wouldn't let me through the front entrance. Wrong clothes, wrong appearance, not on the list. So I waited in the service corridor, thinking if I could just play something, just demonstrate that music matters, that real teaching still happens in forgotten corners, maybe someone would listen. Maybe someone would help save what Catherine Hayes died believing in. That music belongs to everyone, not just people in ballrooms like this. The silence that followed felt physical, pressing against skin and conscience. Blackwell stood frozen, his checkbook forgotten, his face showing the first genuine emotion beyond arrogance that had crossed it all evening. Recognition of complicity, the uncomfortable awareness that his world's luxury existed in direct relationship to someone else's deprivation. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his hand extended. The old man took it, standing slowly, arthritis protesting the movement. "Your name," Morrison said. "I need to know your name." "Thomas Hayes Sullivan," the old man replied. "She gave me her middle name when I graduated. Said it made me family." Morrison nodded slowly, something like awe and grief mingling on his weathered face. "Mr. Sullivan, I sit on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. So does Patricia. So do about 20 other people in this room. We're going to fix this. Not with a check, with a commitment. That school will be funded. Those students will be taught. And your story, Catherine Hayes' story, will be told the way it deserves to be told. I promise you that." From across the room, a woman's voice called out, "The Blackwell Foundation will match whatever amount the Metropolitan Arts Foundation commits. Double it." Every head turned toward Amanda Blackwell, Richard's wife, who'd been silent throughout the evening until this moment. She stood in a silver gown that cost more than Sullivan's annual salary, her face set in lines that suggested long-standing disappointment with a man beside her. "And Richard will personally endow a Catherine Hayes Fellowship for music education in public schools. Won't you, darling?" The way she said darling carried enough ice to freeze oceans. Blackwell's face had gone gray, trapped between social obligation and pride, recognizing that his wife had just publicly committed his name and resources in a way he couldn't refuse without losing everything that mattered to him: reputation, standing, influence. Every phone in the room was out now, recording, waiting for his response. "Of course," he managed, his voice strangled. "The Catherine Hayes Fellowship, $1 million, administered through the Metropolitan Arts Foundation for public school music programs. He'd be written about tomorrow, praised in papers and online, his generosity celebrated by people who would never know about the cruelty that preceded it, who would see only the donation and not the humiliation that forced it. His reputation would survive this. But something else, his certainty in his own judgment, his comfort in casual cruelty, had been shattered irreparably. If you've made it this far in this story, watching a forgotten teacher reclaim dignity through music, watching wealth confront its own callousness, I need to ask something of you. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that justice sometimes finds the patient. Comment with your thoughts. Check the description box for more stories about ordinary people demonstrating extraordinary grace. Because these stories matter, not as entertainment, but as reminders that beauty persists in places we stop looking, that dignity survives in people we learn to ignore, that truth eventually demands acknowledgement regardless of who finds it inconvenient. 3 months later, Thomas Sullivan stood in his classroom for the last time as a teacher of students. The room had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The 3 ancient upright pianos that had occupied the space, their keys yellowed and sticking, their soundboards cracked, their tone muddy from decades of elementary school abuse, had been replaced by 4 new digital pianos with weighted keys and headphone jacks, allowing multiple students to practice simultaneously without cacophony. The water-stained ceiling tiles had been removed, replaced with acoustic panels that actually manage sound instead of just containing it. New chairs without wobbly legs lined the walls. Sheet music, organized in color-coded folders by skill level, filled shelves that had been installed by volunteers from the Metropolitan Symphony. But the most significant change couldn't be seen directly. It existed in the building's budget line items, in the district's revised educational priorities, in the superintendent's public comments about core curriculum expansion that included music and art alongside math and reading. Thomas's position had been saved. More than saved. Funded generously enough to bring in a second instructor to handle the growing wait list of students whose parents had suddenly recognized that music education carried value. The school would remain open, redesignated as a magnet program for arts integration, drawing students from across the district. Thomas had chosen to retire anyway. At 73, the arthritis that had made performing increasingly difficult now made teaching 8 hours daily nearly impossible. His hands ached by noon most days, required ice and compression wraps by evening. The energy needed to manage classrooms of 30 children, to demonstrate techniques repeatedly, to maintain enthusiasm through 6 identical classes of the week, he no longer possessed it consistently enough to give students what they deserved. He trained his replacement personally over the past 8 weeks. Jennifer Martinez, 26 years old, recent graduate from Berklee College of Music, who'd grown up in this same neighborhood, attended this same school as a child, taken music lessons in this same room from a different teacher long retired. She'd learned piano from her grandmother, learned to love teaching from watching Thomas work, recognized that technical skill mattered less than believing music could save lives. She stood beside him now, arranging tomorrow's lesson plans, her energy and optimism reminding him of his own youngest self, that person who'd believed consistent effort could prevent beauty from being extinguished entirely. The after-school program starts next week, Jennifer said, checking her tablet. 23 students signed up. 11 of them qualify for free lunch, so they get instruments to take home, funded through the Catherine Hayes Fellowship. I'm nervous about managing that many. You'll be fine, Thomas assured her, his voice carrying the certainty of decades. Remember what I told you about the kid who never seems to listen? They are listening hardest. The one who makes jokes during scales. They are scared of failure. The quiet one in the back who never raises their hand. They go home and practice for hours. You're teaching humans, not instruments. Music is just a language. Jennifer nodded, making notes. Since the gala, since the funding, since the news coverage that had turned Thomas briefly into a local celebrity, a role he'd tolerated with barely concealed discomfort, the school had changed in ways both welcome and unsettling. Parents who'd never attended conferences now showed up asking about their children's musical development. The principal, who'd previously viewed music class as supervised playtime that freed up period for testing prep, now bragged at district meetings about arts integration. Thomas recognized the political expediency, the way crisis and publicity had transformed neglect into priority without addressing the systemic indifference that had caused the neglect originally. But he also recognized progress, however motivated. Students were learning. Music survived another generation. Catherine Hayes' legacy continued. The fellowship bearing her name had expanded beyond his school, funding music programs in 7 other districts, hiring 12 new teachers, purchasing 300 instruments. Patricia Thornton had commissioned a biography of Catherine, worked with researchers to compile her scattered life, the performances in Paris, the recordings made in small studios that had been gathering dust in French archives, the letters she'd written to family back home describing life in America with careful omissions of disappointment. Some recordings have been digitally restored, released on streaming platforms with liner notes explaining her story. Music students at the conservatory now studied her interpretations, analyzing her pedaling techniques and rhythmic flexibility. Her name, forgotten for 40 years, was being remembered properly. Richard Blackwell had donated his $1 million as promised, then quietly removed himself from the Metropolitan Arts Foundation board. Amanda Blackwell had remained, increased her involvement actually, started attending school visits and student performances. Thomas had seen her at 2 of his final recitals, sitting in the back wearing jeans and a sweater instead of designer clothes, applauding earnestly for 10-year-olds stumbling through fur elise. She'd approached him after the second performance, asked if they could speak privately. They'd sat in the school cafeteria, empty after hours, smelling of industrial cleanser and tomorrow's institutional lunch, and she'd apologized. Not for Richard's behavior, but for her own silence during years of marriage to a man whose casual cruelty she'd enabled through inaction. She'd known about the gala challenge before he'd issued it, had watched from across the room expecting humiliation that would make for amusing dinner conversation later. She'd been complicit. She wanted Thomas to know she recognized that, was working to dismantle in herself the calculus that had made someone else's dignity feel less important than social comfort. Thomas had accepted the apology because refusal seemed pointless, but also because he'd seen genuine change in her subsequent actions. The increased donations, yes, but also the presence, the willingness to sit through elementary recitals where 9 of 10 students played wrong notes, to recognize that education meant witnessing imperfection and believing in potential. Richard himself had disappeared from public arts events entirely. Rumors suggested Amanda had filed for divorce, that his companies were being audited by multiple regulatory agencies, that the casual cruelty displayed at the gala had been just a visible symptom of deeper ethical rot now being investigated. Thomas felt no particular satisfaction in this. He never wanted revenge, only recognition that beauty mattered and dignity was universal. He looked around his classroom one final time as a teacher, cataloging memory. 23 years in this particular building, 20 years in another before that, all in service of the belief Catherine Hayes had given him, that music was resistance against a world designed to reduce humans to numbers and functions and economic units. He'd taught perhaps 3,000 students total. Most had forgotten everything musical within years of moving forward. Perhaps 500 still played casually, music providing pleasure or stress relief in adult lives. Maybe 50 had pursued music seriously, teachers, performers, composers, music therapists. And one, Jennifer, was taking his place, carrying forward the specific lineage that connected back through him to Catherine to the masters who'd taught her. That was legacy, not fame or recognition or money or monuments. Just unbroken chain of human teaching human, beauty passed hand to hand through generations of people mostly forgotten by history, maturing intensely to the individuals they touched. His hands trembled as he packed the last items from his desk. Catherine's photograph and card, which he'd kept framed here for 43 years, went into a padded envelope for transport home. A metronome that had belonged to his own childhood teacher. The baton his first conducting instructor had given him at university. Small objects carrying outsized meaning, valuable only through association and memory. The piano at home, the upright Catherine had owned, which her landlord had offered him after she died, waited for him. He still practiced daily, working through repertoire his arthritis increasingly denied him, maintaining relationship with music that existed beyond teaching. Jennifer walked him to the parking lot, helped carry his boxes. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across pavement where students had played at recess hours earlier, where tomorrow they'd play again with no awareness that history had bent slightly in this place, that the building they occupied learning multiplication tables and grammar rules had been site of grace and justice, of dignity reclaimed and beauty defended. "Thank you," Jennifer said, stopping beside his old Honda, 20 years old, burning oil, due for replacement except that replacement meant new car payment and his retirement budget was tight. "For everything you've taught me. For trusting me with this." Thomas smiled, the expression deepening lines decades of work had carved. "Catherine trusted me with nothing but belief I could do it. That's all teaching is, trusting forward. You'll do the same someday, probably sooner than you think." He loaded the last box, closed the trunk. "Remember, music isn't entertainment. It's not career preparation. It's not college application padding. It's every student's birthright, the inheritance Catherine believed all humans deserve. Dignity made audible. Soul's defense against a world that wants us numbered and afraid. You're not teaching piano. You're teaching resistance. Don't ever forget that." He drove home through familiar streets, past neighborhoods where his students lived, apartments and small houses, corner stores with security glass, parks where equipment needed repair, the geography of American poverty that existed blocks away from downtown towers where billionaires worked. Music played on his radio, classical station, a piano concerto he half-listened to while his mind wandered through memory and forward into uncertain future. Retirement meant time to practice, to play, to perhaps perform again in small venues that welcomed amateurs. But it also meant loss of daily contact with students, with a renewable energy young people brought, with a meaning derived from clear purpose clearly executed. In his living room, Catherine's piano waited. He sat at the bench without removing his coat, let his aching hands find keys, began playing scales to warm, stiff joints. The instrument's tone, though maintained carefully over 40 years, showed its age, some notes brighter than others, the action slightly heavy, sympathetic vibrations in the soundboard creating complex overtones. Perfect for teaching, less so for performance. Like Thomas himself, like Catherine had been. Functional beauty, serviceable grace. Enough to matter, enough to pass forward, enough to justify the sacrifice. 2 years after Thomas Sullivan's retirement, the Grand Millennium Hotel Ballroom hosted another Metropolitan Arts Foundation gala. The chandelier light fractured across the same marble floors, the same type of guests wore the same expensive clothing, waiters circulated with the same precision. Superficially, nothing had changed. The wealthy gathered to write checks that would reduce their taxes while photographers captured their generosity. The fundamental architecture of charity, where excess wealth created the deprivation it then partially alleviated through selective giving, remained intact. But details revealed shifts. The event program listed the Catherine Hayes Fellowship prominently on the first page, noting it had now expanded to 43 schools across 5 districts, employed 37 music teachers, provided instruments to over 800 students. Patricia Thornton's biography of Catherine Hayes had been published 6 months earlier, reviewed respectfully in major papers, adopted by several university music programs as required reading. A documentary crew was filming interviews with Catherine's former students, the ones they could locate after decades, asking what her teaching had meant, how it had shaped lives. Thomas attended this gala as invited guest rather than interloper, though he wore the same faded suit, refused to purchase new clothes for a single event. He sat at a table near the front, alongside Dr. Morrison and Patricia Thornton and Jennifer Martinez, whose students would perform later in the evening. Amanda Blackwell sat 3 tables away with her new partner, a civil rights attorney who specialized in educational equity cases. Richard Blackwell had not been invited. His companies had indeed faced multiple investigations, resulting in settlements and restructuring. He'd moved to Arizona, attempted to rebuild reputation away from the city where his cruelty had been recorded and redistributed on social media millions of times. The video of him mocking Thomas had become shorthand reference, pulling a Blackwell, for wealthy people publicly demonstrating callous indifference to human dignity. The evening's Hyatt entertainment was different than 2 years prior. Instead of a young prodigy performing background music, students from the Catherine Hayes Fellowship programs rotated through short performances, some stumbling through simplified classics, some playing with genuine skill, all of them demonstrating that music education reached beyond concert halls into public schools where most American children actually learned. The audience, trained to appreciate technical perfection, learned to value something else: effort, growth, potential. The visible transformation of children discovering beauty was accessible. Jennifer's student Emma Chen, 11 years old, daughter of restaurant workers who both worked 14-hour days, performed a Chopin nocturne with passion that exceeded her technical ability. She rushed some passages, missed notes in others, her pedaling imprecise. But something in her playing carried urgency and emotion that polished performances often lacked. She played like the music mattered beyond performance, like it meant something personal and profound. When she finished, the applause lasted longer than technical perfection usually warranted. People recognized they'd witnessed not entertainment but transformation, evidence that music education could reach the students who needed it most. Thomas watched from his table, arthritis preventing him from applauding as vigorously as he wished, feeling complex emotions he couldn't completely untangle. Pride in Jennifer's teaching, in Emma's courage, in the system that had been built partially because he'd asked to play one song. Grief that Catherine hadn't lived to see her name honored, her legacy expanded, her belief vindicated. frustration that charity remained necessary because basic equity remained unavailable, that children accessed music through wealthy people's discretionary generosity rather than guaranteed public commitment. Gratitude that this moment existed at all, that beauty persisted, that some battles could be won even if the war continued indefinitely. After the student performances, Patricia Thornton took the microphone. She announced a new initiative. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation would work with the school district to make music education mandatory in all elementary schools, funded through a combination of property tax reallocation and matching donations from the foundation. It would take 3 years to implement fully, require hiring 80 new teachers, purchasing 2,000 instruments. But the commitment was real, the funding secured, the political will finally mobilized. Music would become right rather than privilege, available to all students regardless of zip code or family income. The audience applauded this announcement with varying enthusiasm. Some donors recognized their taxes would increase to fund something their own children accessed privately. Others understood that universalizing access would reduce the social capital derived from selective giving. But public commitment had been made, recorded, witnessed. Backing away would cost more than acceptance. During the reception following announcements, a young woman approached Thomas's table. She was 24, wearing a simple dress clearly not custom-made, carrying herself with determination that suggested she'd argued with security to enter. Her face carried vague familiarity Thomas couldn't immediately place. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't know if you remember me. I was in your class 14 years ago. 4th grade. You taught me to play Moon River for my grandmother before she died. She'd sung it to me when I was little, and I wanted to play it for her in the hospital. You stayed after school 3 days a week for 2 months helping me learn it, even though I was terrible at piano and gave up after that year." Memories surfaced slowly, a serious child with precise questions, determined despite limited natural ability. "I remember. Your grandmother cried when you played for her. She died 2 days later. That memory, playing for her, seeing her smile, knowing I'd given her something beautiful before the end. It's one of my most important. I became a nurse partially because of that experience, wanting to help families have meaningful moments during hard times. I work in palliative care now, pediatric hospice. I tell families about music therapy, about how beauty matters even at the end, especially at the end. I wanted to thank you. You probably don't remember every student, but you changed my life completely by spending time helping me learn one song for one person. I needed you to know that." She left before Thomas could respond adequately, disappearing back into the crowd, leaving him blinking away tears and confronting the reality of teaching, that impact rarely manifested obviously, that live change through small moments amplified across years, that measuring success required patience beyond any individual lifetime. Near midnight, as the gala wound down and guests departed toward waiting cars, Thomas stood near the piano where this had begun. The same Steinway, polished and perfect, its value exceeding most people's annual income. He thought about Catherine Hayes, the prodigy who'd performed across Europe, who'd sacrificed career for broken promise, who'd taught for 30 years in obscurity, who'd died believing music mattered more than recognition. He thought about the 3,000 students he'd taught, most of whom had forgotten him, some of whom carried forward small pieces of what he'd given them, a few of whom would teach others in turn. He thought about wealth and poverty, about dignity and humiliation, about the exhausting necessity of fighting for beauty in a world designed to reduce everything to transaction and profit. Jennifer approached, her evening finally finished, her energy depleted but satisfied. "Emma wants to study music seriously. Her parents asked about scholarships, conservatory programs. I told them we'd find resources." "We will," Thomas assured her. "There's money now. There are systems. What Catherine started, what we've continued, it's not finished, but it's sustainable. More kids will learn. Some will teach. The chain continues." They walked to the parking lot together, warm night air replacing the ballroom's air-conditioned perfection. Thomas's old Honda sat beside newer cars, its age and wear obvious. He didn't care. The vehicle functioned. It transported him adequately. Enough was enough. Catherine had taught him that. that survival and dignity and beauty mattered more than status or possession, that music was defense against world that wanted to number and diminish everyone, that teaching was the highest form of resistance against systems designed to convince people they didn't matter. He drove home through streets he'd navigated for decades, past schools where children would learn music tomorrow because someone had decided they deserved access to beauty, past apartments and houses where students practiced on instruments provided by programs that existed because one old man had asked to play one song. Small victories, modest progress, incremental justice. Not enough, never enough, but more than nothing, more than surrender, more than despair. At home, Catherine's piano waited. He sat at the bench in darkness, let his damaged hands find keys, played Claire de Lune the way she'd taught him. Slowly, with space for notes to breathe and decay, stripping away showmanship to reveal the essential humanity underneath. His arthritis made some passages difficult, some notes blurred, but the interpretation remained intact. Music as resistance, beauty as defiance, dignity made audible despite a world that wanted silence. If you've stayed until the end of this story, if you've watched Thomas Sullivan reclaim dignity through one song, watched a forgotten teacher's legacy honored, watched children gain access to beauty they've been denied, then you've witnessed more than entertainment. You've witnessed evidence that justice sometimes finds the patient, that beauty persists in places we stop looking, that ordinary people contain extraordinary grace. So I'm asking you now to do something simple. Like this video to help it reach people who need to hear that patience and dignity matter. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about grace under pressure. Share this with someone who's fighting for beauty in an indifferent world. Comment with your thoughts about what teaching means, what music does, how we defend humanity against systems designed to crush it. Check the description box below for more stories about quiet heroes and delayed justice. Because these stories matter, not as entertainment, but as reminders that we're not alone in believing certain things are worth defending regardless of cost or recognition. Thomas played until his hands ached too much to continue, until exhaustion demanded rest. He rose from the bench slowly, arthritis protesting, age making every movement deliberate. Tomorrow he'd practice again. The day after, again. Maintaining relationship with beauty that existed beyond audience or achievement, playing for himself and Catherine's memory and the students who'd carry forward what both of them had believed. That music belongs to everyone. That dignity is birthright, not privilege. That teaching is sacred work regardless of compensation or recognition. The piano fell silent. The house settled into night. The story ended as all stories must, in quiet darkness, questions partially answered, justice incomplete but advancing, beauty surviving another generation through people willing to defend it when defense seemed futile. Enough. Not victory. Not revolution. Not transformation of systems designed to crush. But enough to matter. Enough to continue. Enough to justify the sacrifice of everyone who'd believed music could save lives one student at a time, one song at a time, one generation teaching the next that beauty was resistance and dignity was everyone's inheritance, regardless of what the world insisted was true.